Hello, you guys. Good morning. It's Sunday, the Cinco de Mayo, so it's the 5th of May. My computer is warming up. Ham wants me to go live with him well, I can't tell, at roughly 40 minutes. So I wanted to, I guess I'll just have to keep this pretty short. That show? Do I look presentable? I saw two comments I don't normally see. I guess I was, forget why. One comment on my video yesterday is, so GTII is dead? WTF happened? Well, I did a pretty long video on an idea. That's it. But if you haven't been paying attention over basically 2.5 to 3 years, what happened to GTII is, I believe the company for a long time did everything they could think of to cause the system to have a buy-in, do their job. I'm not going to go over that right now. I've done it so many times, but I'll do it again until everyone understands it. But I think what we've learned is that the SEC and et cetera are not there to protect retail. They're there to protect the big pools of money. And they justify it, I guess, by saying, well, retail should just put the money with the big boys and let us earn our fees off of it. But I'll do more on that. I'll do more on what happened with GTII and where to go from here. The bottom line is there never was a buy-in that I could see except for that one brief period of time, which is controversial. The second comment I saw was, hey, I'd like to invest. Where can I start? How can I do it? And that's really what triggered this video this morning. This is an article I haven't read. I'm going to read it with you. It's by David Stockman. And for those who are too young, David Stockman took the world by the storm as Ronald Reagan's budget director. At that time, I thought he was, full of it. But maybe I'm like Winston Churchill said, when you're young, you're liberal, and if you're not conservative when you're older, you're, I don't know, I forget how he said it. I'm still a Democrat, so I guess I still hang on to my ideals, but boy, it's tough. So in response to that question, the main thing I want people to understand, and I've been trying to say it, I get all sorts of flashbacks that are just bumper sticker triggers for emotions, but from war in 3 spots of the world, and we don't have the ability to defend ourselves, the squandering of trillions of dollars, the opening of our borders, which I'm not against in principle, but when you accept people in who you don't even screen for health, criminal records, etc. I mean, and they're not really acclimated. Anyway, we'll see. It's a big experiment. We've got, my thing that no one else talks about is Fukushima Daiichi is, in my opinion, destroying the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere. And we've got the big, the big pharma, the big agriculture, and it looks like the big Israel lobbies, big banks, all own the government. They all own the government. Our government is bought and paid for. And one of the things that the banks are doing is they are in trouble. It sounds odd to say it, but I see a lot of money chasing things like equities, houses, other items. At the same time, there's a liquidity problem. And why? Because the debt-based system, which we're in, has to keep issuing debt to quote unquote grow. The problem comes in, of course, that the planet and most economies are closed systems, essentially, and it's hard to sustain that growth. And the second problem is the growth goes hyperbolic. And so for me, I think the federal debt's going to go over 100 trillion, and there's going to be a lot of changes in the investment world. So I want to start answering that question. How do you invest now? The last 40 years were complete, I guess you can use the word Goldilocks. I saw it somewhere recently. But they will not come back again. I don't think they'll ever come back again in human history. But those 40 years made Wall Street rich, made real estate brokers rich, and made boomers wealthy. But I just don't think for a new investor that you can rely on past tropes to invest with. So let's read this quickly. This is 6 minutes. This probably won't take me very long. But this is David Stockman on the 1.3 trillion elephant in the room. And he starts with, these people have to be stopped. Remember, this is a conservative guy, if you don't know who Ronald Reagan was. Ronald Reagan came in, and one of his favorites was William F. Buckley, who said that the job of conservatives was to stand athwart history and yell, halt. That was Ronald Reagan. Anyway, we are talking about the nation's unhinged monetary politburo domiciled in the Eccles building, of course. That's the Fed. It is bad enough that their relentless inflation of financial assets has showered the 1%, with untold trillions of windfall gains. But their ultimate crime is that they lured the nation's elected politicians into a veritable fiscal trance. Consequently, future generations will be lugging the service costs on insuperable public debts for years to come. I'm not sure what that, I have to look that up, insuperable. Anyway, for more than 2 decades, these foolish PhDs and monetary apparatchiks drove the entire Treasury yield curve to rock bottom, even as public debt erupted skyward. In this context, the single biggest chunk of the Treasury debt lies in the 90-day T-bill sector. It always confused me. Why didn't they just take advantage of low interest rates and lock in for 30 years? But they didn't. But between December 2000, let me start that sentence since I interrupted it. They brought yields down to rock bottom. In this context, the single biggest chunk of the Treasury debt lies in the 90-day T-bill sector. But between December 2007 That was Our Nation's Gotta Eat. He also said of the financial crisis, he said, this sucker's going down. That's George W. Bush. And then it went into Folks. And then it's gone through the Donald and now into breakfast at Biden's. So between December 2007 and June 2023, the inflation-adjusted yield on this workhorse debt security, that's the 90-day T-bill, was negative 95% of the time. The inflation-adjusted yield on T-bills for 15 years, 16 years, was negative 95% of the time. That's right. During that 187-month span, the interest rate exceeded the running inflation rate during only 9 months, as depicted by the purple area picking above the zero bound in the chart. And even then, just by a tad. All the rest of the time, Uncle Sam was happily taxing the inflationary rise in nominal incomes, even as Uncle Sam's debt service payments were dramatically lagging the 78% rise of CPI during that period. So this chart here gives you the inflation-adjusted yield on 90-day T-bills from 2007 to 2022. That's through 4 presidents. And I'll point it out. I can't see if you can see it. That's the only time that the yield was higher than inflation. The rest of the time, it was always at a discount. It was manipulated, as all our markets are. This chart shows the fiscal equivalent of Novocaine. It enabled the elected politicians to merrily jig up and down Pennsylvania Avenue and stroll the K Street corridors, dispensing bountiful goodies left and right, while experiencing nary a moment of pain from the massive debt burden they were piling on the mainstream economy. This all comes out of Liz Cheney's father's pithy observation. Deficits don't matter anymore, he said. Anyway, accordingly, during the quarter century between Q4 1997 and Q1 2022, the public debt soared from 5.5 trillion. So this is the end of the Clinton era. It soared from 5.5 trillion to 30.4 trillion. That's into the breakfast at Biden era, or by 453%. Public debt soared by 453%, essentially in this century. In any rational world, a commiserate rise in the federal interest expense would surely awaken at least some of the revilers. But not in the Fed world. As it happened, Uncle Sam's interest expense only increased by 73%. So the debt ran up and the interest expense, they took debt from 5 trillion to 30 trillion. But the cost of interest only went up by 73%. It rose from 368 billion to 635 billion per year in that same period. By contrast, listen to this, by contrast, had interest rates remained at the not unreasonable levels posted in late 1997, The interest expense level by Q1 2022, when the Fed finally awakened to the inflationary monster it had fostered, would have been 2.03 trillion per annum. If interest rates had just stayed at the low, moderate level they were, essentially at the beginning of the century, just before, a couple of years before, and the country borrowed this kind of money, ran up this debt, our annual interest expense would have been $2 trillion a year. All right, I just, you can tell when I'm talking and I'm not reading. Okay, back to reading. In short, the Fed's reckless and relentless repression of interest rates during that quarter century fostered an elephant in the room that was one for the ages. Annualized federal interest expense was fully $1.3 trillion lower than it would have been had the yield curve in place been the one in Q4 1997. Alas, the missing interest expense amounted to the equivalent of the entire Social Security budget. The missing interest expense amounted to the equivalent of the entire Social Security budget. So, we'd guess the politicians might have been aroused from their slumber had interest expense reflected market rates. Instead, they were actually getting dreadfully wrong price signals. And the present fiscal catastrophe is the consequence. Here's a chart. The purple line shows the growth in the debt over this last 25 years or so. And the bottom line is the growth in the interest on that debt. Needless to say, the U.S. economy was not wallowing in failure or underperformance at the rates which prevailed in 1997. In fact, during that year, real GDP growth was 4.5%. Inflation was just 1.7%. Real median family income rose by 3.2%. Job growth was 2.8%. And the real interest rates on the 10-year Treasury was 4%. In short, 1997 generated one of the strongest macroeconomic performances in recent decades. That was Bill Clinton. Even with inflation-adjusted yields on the 10-year UST of 4%. So there was no compelling reason for a massive compression of interest rates. But that is exactly what the Fed engineered over the next 2 decades. As shown in the graph below, rates were systemically pushed lower by 300 to 500 basis points, by 3 to 5%, across the curve by the bottom of 2021. Current yields, that's now, right now, current yields are higher by 300 to 400 basis points from this recent bottom. But here's the thing, they are only back to the nominal levels prevalent at the beginning of the period, which started in 1997, even as inflation is running at 3 to 4% year over year, up, or double the levels of 1997. Here's the graph. The blue line on the bottom, you can see they kept it at the bottom of the chart. Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen and I don't know when Greenspan left. Unfortunately, even as the Fed has tepidly moved toward normalization of yields, as shown in the graph above, Wall Street is bringing unrelenting pressure for a new round of rate cuts, which would result in yet another spree of the deep interest rate repression and distortion, which has fueled Washington's fiscal binge since the turn of the century. Well, my printer blocked out a whole paragraph. As it is, the public debt is already growing at a accelerating clip. There's 3 sentences completely blocked out. So he goes on to say that it's growing at 10 billion per day, 416 million per hour. In fact, Uncle Sam's debt has risen by 470 billion in the first 2 months of this year to 34.5 trillion and is on a pace to surpass 35 trillion in a little over a month. 37 trillion before year's end and 40 trillion sometime in 2025. My own prediction, we're going to go to war. It'll be 100 trillion. That's about 2 years ahead of the current CBO forecast, Congressional Budget Office. Here's a chart of it. On the current path, moreover, the public debt will reach 60 trillion by the end of the 10-year budget window. But even that depends on the Congressional Budget Office's latest iteration of rosy scenario, which envisions no recession ever again, just 2% inflation as far as the eye can see, and real interest rates of barely 1%. And that's to say nothing of the trillions in phony spending cuts and out-year tax increases which are built into the CBO baseline, but which Congress will never actually allow to materialize. What is worse, even with the partial normalization of rates, a veritable tsunami of federal interest expense is now gathering steam. That is because the ultra-low yields of 2007 to 2022 are now rolling over into the current market rates shown above, at the same time that the amount of public debt outstanding is heading, or should I say, my words, rocketing skyward. As a result, the annualized run rate of federal interest expense, that's 1 year's worth of interest on the debt, hit 1.1 trillion in February. The annualized run rate of federal interest expense hit 1.1 trillion in February and is heading for 1.6 trillion by the end of the current fiscal year, September. Finally, even as the run rate of interest expense has been soaring, the bureaucrats at the US Treasury have been drastically shortening the maturity of the outstanding debt as it rolls over. They're doing what the idiot banks did. Why not lock in long-term debt at low rates instead of, but our whole government is run by quickly promoted because they check the box people, just like the banks are. Anyway, accordingly, more than 21 trillion of Treasury paper has been refinanced in the under 1 year T-bill market, thereby lowering the weighted average maturity of public debt to less than 5 years. Do you see the trap? They can't let interest rates go up, but they are going up. So if confidence in the bond market collapses and the dollar, and these same women and men are accelerating the move away from the dollar by using the dollar as a weapon. Anyway, the last little bit was me. The apparent bet is that the Fed will be cutting rates soon. As is becoming more apparent by the day, however, that's just not in the cards. No matter how you slice it, the running level of inflation has remained exceedingly sticky and shows no signs of dropping below its current 3 to 4% range anytime soon. I think that's a low estimate. What is also becoming more apparent by the day is that the money printers at the Fed have led Washington into a massive fiscal calamity. It's only a matter of time, therefore, until the brown stuff hits the fan like never before. The truth is, we're on the cusp of an economic crisis which could eclipse anything we've seen before, and most people won't be prepared for what's coming. So let's leave it there. I'm going to go get on the live. And we'll catch you in just a minute. Remember, we have to be our own central banks. We have to get out of, bet against, whatever you want to say, the debt-based system, and become our own islands of fiscal sanity. See you in a minute.